Добрый день, уважаемые друзья.
Good afternoon, dear friends. We continue our online conference at the Moscow Urban Forum, City for Everyone, Health, Well-being and Sustainability for Everyone. I'd like to introduce you our star speaker, who doesn't need any presentation. This is Edward Glaeser, Professor Emeritus from Taubman Institute of Big Boston in the University of Harvard. Edward, good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I do think that we all are professionals, and everyone who is interested in economics and in city management certainly are familiar with your book, The Triumph of a City, how actually the innovations make us healthier, greener, etc. And you have listed the main factors, and you will help us speak more about that, and we'll have some time for discussion.
Thank you. Shall I begin? The translation was not working for me, so I didn't understand all of that. But
Yes, please go on. Please go on.
We have
Shall I begin,
problem
Isaac?
with translation.
Is the translator ready?
You can start. You can start
Okay,
your presentation. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be with you. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I'd like to speak to you about the enduring strength of cities. So prior to COVID-19, prior to 2020, it seemed clear that we were looking at a world that was driven by urbanization, both in the developing world, where we had learned in 2007 that we had become a majority urban species, and in the wealthy cities of the West. What you're looking at here is a figure of density across the European Union, because at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. The blue line shows the relationship between per capita GDP, or productivity and density, across the European Union. And as you can see, the densest parts of Europe are twice as productive per capita as the least dense parts of Europe. This is something economists call agglomeration economies. The tremendous advantages that come from enmeshing yourself in a maelstrom of economic activity. The red line shows the relationship between population growth and density. So as you can see, the line goes up as you get denser, which tells us that in fact, places that started with more crowding only became more crowded over time. So whereas in the start of the 19th century in the US, Americans were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, just as Russians were leaving the east to go west, leaving the west to go east. In the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we are clustering in. Within the United States, and you should be able to see this map here, the largest problem that the US and Europe had, or one of the largest ones prior to 2020, was the rise of long-term joblessness. Between 1967, when I was born, and the past 10 years, the share of prime-aged men who were not working has tripled from under 5% to over 15%. That share, that rise of joblessness, is very much of a spatial phenomenon. In dense cities, in big metropolitan areas, in places like Moscow, there are jobs in the urban service sector. But in low density parts of America, as the manufacturing jobs left, there was nothing that could take its place. And whereas I could imagine a world in which the creativity of urban entrepreneurs would continue to create work, even in an age of automation in cities, I couldn't figure out what people would possibly do in the least dense parts of America. As COVID-19 has shut down our ability to connect face-to-face, I worry that all of those service sector jobs, that's 1/5 of the American labor force, will disappear entirely. And that in fact, we will look at a world in which all of work faces is in peril. Now, as you can see, this image that I'm showing you here is often associated with the plague of Athens. It's actually not. It's a biblical plague painted by Nicolas Poussin, the Baroque artist. But the plague of Athens reminds us of what an existential threat pandemics can be for cities. The backstory behind the plague of Athens was that Pericles had devised a strategy for fighting with the Athenian enemy state of Sparta. Because Sparta was better on land and Athens was better on sea, Pericles would summon his friends behind, his citizens behind the walls of Athens, where they would be protected from the Spartan soldiers, and send out the Athenian fleet to harass the Peloponnesian coast. It was a perfectly sensible strategy militarily. The walls did keep out the Spartan soldiers, but they did not keep out the pandemic. Plague came into Athens through its port, because cities are nodes on the great transportation network that connect our world, and that makes them particularly vulnerable. On top of this, the crowding that occurs within cities, the connections between people, often allows the pandemic to spread quickly, and that is indeed what we've seen over the past year. As diseases have worked their way in through cities and cities themselves are shut down, we've had a remarkably good picture of what's happened in cities that has been a result of the cell phone records that have been made available. And what you can see here is the decline in mobility in Brazil, the US, Mexico, Italy, and Germany over the period from March, which is when mobility really crashed, to July. You can see Italy is particularly struck. There was a 90% reduction in mobility in Italy in March and April relative to the pre-pandemic period. And in some sense, if cities are all about connection, the social distancing that we saw post-COVID is in some sense a rapid de-urbanization of our world, an abandonment of urban connection. Moreover, in the first stages of the pandemic, it struck cities most terribly. In the US, the pandemic entered through New York City, just as earlier pandemics did, and then it filtered out towards other dense areas first. And here you can see the relationship between population density and the level of the pandemic about May, okay? But as it has spread, it started off, as you can see in this map, it started off in the dense enclaves of the Eastern Seaboard, and then gradually it spread everywhere. Because in fact, this pandemic does not actually require urban proximity for it to spread. It just requires some human connection. So it starts in New York, it starts in New Orleans. And then as you can see now, this is over the last week, it is most.
Edward?
Edward, we cannot hear you. We cannot hear you.
We don't hear you.
In Brazil, in India as well, the disease came first to the most dense parts of the city. This is the relationship between the share of the population living in a favela, that's a high density informal settlement in Brazil, and the spread of the pandemic as of June 3rd, 2020. This is the relationship between the share of the population living in slums and the spread of the pandemic in India. The Indian pandemic appears to have worked its way out in slums. The work of the IDRC and Anup Malani suggests that, in fact, we may have already reached in some Indian slums herd immunity, that over 50% of the people in the slums may have actually acquired antibodies. Now, it is important to recognize that it is crowding, it is personal connection, not density, that necessarily spreads this disease. This is a map of Manhattan and the rest of New York City. And for those of you who don't know the city, this long sliver of an island, this here at the center, this is the densest part of the city. It is also the part of the city that had the fewest cases by May 2020. Whereas it was the less dense parts of the city, the outlying areas where the disease was most terrible. The reason for that can be seen on the right-hand side of the figures. Here you can see the reduction in the number of trips. And in fact, the densest parts of the city were the areas where you saw the strongest behavioral reaction, where you saw the decline in trips, partially because the people were wealthier and partially because they knew that moving around created risk. And it's precisely because you have this relationship between density and the reduction of trips that you have a relationship between density and the disease that's actually negative, not positive. This shows you the relationship between the change in the number of trips and the number of cases. The estimates that I've done with Stephen Redding and Caitlin Gorbeck show that a 10% drop in trips was associated with a 20% reduction in the number of cases. And these trips are measured both with cell phone data and with data from the public transit system. This crisis, of course, is not just a health crisis, it's an economic crisis. The unemployment rate in the United States, which reached 15% in April 2020, has not been seen since the Great Depression. In some sense, our whole evolution of our urban world has put us into a maximum point of pandemic vulnerability. If you think about our arc from farm to factory work to urban service work, right? We have moved ourselves from a employment mode where, in fact, farmers benefited from the pandemic in the medieval period, from the Black Plague. It was terrible. It killed 1/3 of Europe. But since wealth in an agricultural society is based on the amount of land per person, because there were fewer people, there was more land per person and more wealth. The factory economies of the industrial age were also slightly less vulnerable because the product of the factories didn't hinge on face-to-face connection. And whereas the influenza pandemic of 1919 and 1920 was associated with a short, sharp drop in economic output, it was over quickly and the economy restarted. By contrast, the face-to-face urban service jobs that you can see here, the worker who is selling a latte with a smile that someone is willing to pay for, those jobs have been a safe haven in an era of automation, in an era of outsourcing. But those jobs can vanish in a heartbeat when that smile becomes a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. And the 32 million American workers who work in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade, the key face-to-face jobs, are the ones who are at most risk. The level of economic carnage really was extraordinary. This comes from work that I've done with a series of co-authors surveying small businesses in the US. We found that as of April 1st, 2020, 45% of small businesses were shut. This was not something that was uniform. In some industries, like, for example, personal services or arts or entertainment, more than 70% of the businesses were closed. In other industries, such as finance or professional services, less than 21% were closed. Perhaps the most shocking thing that came out for us from this data was the share that expected to be closed in December. 37% of our businesses expected to be closed as of now. To a certain extent, very large financial measures from the American government have tried to stave that off. But this is an economic crisis that will take years for us to sort our way out. Now, the last thing I want to say something on is whether or not this shift will actually cause a major reorientation away from face-to-face contact in the cities that enable that contact. Will we all zoom our way to work going forward? In some sense, this is part of an age-long dance between technology and the city. The image that you're looking at here is the aqueduct at Segovia, which is one of the most classic examples of a technology that has shaped cities, and it is a centripetal technology. It is a technology that enables us to connect closer to one another. Much of the 19th century was an era of centripetal technologies, like the streetcar, like the skyscraper. The 20th century, however, was a centrifugal age. Technologies like cars, like radios, like televisions enabled us to disperse from our urban spaces, enabled us to build suburbs, to build exurbs, to live farther away from cities, and people moved out from our urban ages. Urban industries dispersed, and you can see here an image of the garment industry in New York City, which was the largest industrial agglomeration in the United States during the 1950s, larger than automobiles in Detroit. And it was killed off by automation and outsourcing. 500,000 jobs were lost in a few short years. That decline of urban industry led prognosticators to think that, in fact, new forms of technology, like the fax machine, like the personal computer, would kill off the service industries that remain, right? And so when I started in this business 40 years ago, people like Alvin Toffler were predicting that these technologies would stop cities from being relevant. So would they kill off finance and urban infrastructure? Now, for the last 30 years of my life, I've argued that those predictions were a mistake, and that what globalization and new technologies did is they radically increased the returns to being smart, and that we are a social species that becomes smart by being around other smart people. That's why Google didn't send its workers home, but it bought the Googleplex. That's why finance remained in big cities, because in finance, it is incredibly important to know exactly what's going on. And face-to-face contact enables us to become smart by being close to other smart people. And so for 40 years, Toffler has looked like he's completely wrong. But now perhaps he is right, right? That is the fear that's been brought up, right? You can see here the decline of people going to work over the past 6 months, 50% reduction in people going in. So what do we actually know about this? And I'm going to share with you 3 figures, and please leave the figures up and stop taking them off for a second, because I really do want people to see these. So the 3 figures give us 3 pictures that are important to understand about remote working. The first of which is how large a phenomenon it is, but how unequal a phenomenon it is. So there were 50 million Americans who had lost their jobs due to COVID-19 in May 2020, and there were 50 million Americans who were remote working. But that was very unequally distributed across the education distribution. Only 14% of people with advanced degrees had lost their jobs due to COVID, and 70% of them were remote working. But among those who had high school degrees or less, 20% of them had lost their work, but less than 15% of them were remote working. And so the view of people who think that there is a remote job for someone who does not have an advanced degree, that has no bearing in the data. Second fact that I want you to sort of pay attention, please keep the graphs up. We polled these small businesses and we asked them, both small businesses and large businesses, what share of workers who have switched to remote work would stay remote working after COVID. Our small business network, the Alignable Network, 40% of businesses said that 40% or more of workers who switched would stay switched. The National Association of Business Economists, 36%. And that's what you're seeing here, 36% who said that they switched would stay switched. So there's no question that this is a major realignment for these businesses. But that doesn't mean that our cities will remain empty or that businesses will not come back. One impact of a reduction in demand for commercial space in cities is that prices will drop. And this will cause new businesses to move in as old businesses left. And this is the last fact that I think is quite interesting. So this comes from the work of Morales Alia and Daboin, who look at both employment and job postings, looking at burning glass data. And they separate out the jobs into the jobs that can be done remotely. So those are more high-tech jobs, and those jobs that cannot be done remotely. So the non-remote jobs, you can see here, you have both sharp drop in employment and a sharp drop in postings early on. So both the firms fire workers and they don't hire new workers. For the jobs that can be done remotely, and you're seeing that on your right, there is an immediate sharp drop in postings, but they don't fire the workers. So the workers remain. And you saw that in the high-skilled workers who were zooming it in. But look what's happened to postings. The postings have come back for the workers who can only work live, but they have stayed down for the remotable workers. And I think this very much suggests that we are, in fact, in our jobs that are remaining virtual, we are in some sense coasting on fumes. We are living off of relationships that were built face-to-face. And it is much harder to bring someone on, to acculturate them, to make them excited about their job when it's all remote. You know, as a teacher, right, I can say that I find it extraordinarily difficult to handle any sort of new students and get them excited about their work when it's remote, whereas old relationships work. And in some sense, this suggests that it's going to be new firms that are going to be most excited by coming to cities. Looking forward to the future, I think everything depends on the duration of the pandemic and the duration of pandemic risk. So if the pandemic isn't cured next year by the vaccine, if we get another pandemic in the next decade, I think this will be a permanent and painful shock for cities that they will have trouble reacting to. It will also be absolutely catastrophic for the urban service industry, for those 32 million Americans who are in retail, trade, leisure, and hospitality. I think that the downsides of that are so extreme that our elected leaders will have to take every step possible to make sure that that doesn't happen, that we are prepared next time and this is a one-off event. But even if this does end quickly, even if we're done with it in 2021, even if we make sure that we make the health investments that make sure that we stop things from ever happening again, there are still going to be major shocks. In rich cities, there will be a drop in demand for commercial real estate. That means that prices are going to drop. It doesn't mean large-scale vacancies. This means that commercial space may decline, but I think we have seen over and over again how much human beings, particularly young human beings, are eager to reconnect with each other in real life, in real space, to come back out again. I think this suggests that cities are going to come back as places of pleasure and proximity more than places of productivity in the short run. That may mean that commercial space gets reallocated to residential space, and it means that cities must compete more than ever as places of fun, of places of pleasure, as places of creativity. This means that the young will be the ones who will re-urbanize first, who will come back out again. They're less afraid of the pandemic risk, correctly, and they are more eager to connect again in person. This reiterates the importance of consumer amenities, right? I often say the right urban development strategy is to attract and train smart people and then get out of their way. Attracting people is going to be really critical. And if we think about what will make for great cities in the post-pandemic world, it really is going to be about, making the city attractive for people to live there as well as people to work there. Finally, public transportation will continue to face challenges. People are afraid of being on transit close to other people. That will have to be fixed. And I think going forward, it's important to remember the value of flexibility in transit, the ability to change routes, the ability to change seating arrangements. And cities will face the challenge of reductions in international travel probably for quite some time. So I think it's going to be a difficult 5 years, but cities will get through this. Cities have survived far worse. They've survived plagues that are far more catastrophic than COVID-19. And if there's one thing that seems clear about our species, right, we are far more productive, far more joyful, far more creative when we are connected to one another. That is what cities do, and that is why cities fundamentally power our humanity. Thank you.
Эдвард, спасибо большое.
Edward, thank you so much for this, your contribution, for this, your intervention. I have several questions, very brief questions, that we could at least discuss your very busy presentation, busy slides.
Итак, первый вопрос.
My first question. You really told us about the technological solutions which last century resulted in the change in the shape and in the economy of the cities.
С вашей точки зрения, какие новые технологии,
In your opinion, what new technologies
для новых секторов,
may give more opportunities for the new economies in the cities?
какими компетенциями
What competences
экономического развития должны
in
обладать
terms of economic development should the cities have in order to become superstars?
So actually, I think the most important technologies right now are in the health field. The most important technologies are around vaccines, around early warning systems, around the pandemics. I think this pandemic has revealed our vulnerability. We need to have a larger battery of vaccines which are tested for safety, if not for efficacy. And so we can roll them out even more quickly. We need to have a better early warning system that tells us when a pandemic is starting and tells us when to shut down international travel more quickly. It has been an amazing year for health technology research, but we need to not let it stop when we have a functional vaccine, and we need to make sure that we prepare going forward. Technologies continue to be important in the transportation field. And there, I think it's hard to know exactly where we will go, but autonomous vehicles are certainly a thing that will exist. In the case of autonomous vehicles, the critical measure is we need to have congestion pricing sooner, not later. The first order impact of an autonomous vehicle is that it reduces the cost of sitting in traffic. What we know is that this will make people more willing to sit in traffic, which will mean that we will have even more traffic than ever. And far from being liberating and far from being empowering of travel, autonomous vehicles therefore have the capacity to clog our city streets even more unless we actually impose congestion pricing that charges people for the congestion that they create. The last thing I want to highlight is we've had a series of technologies over the past 20 years that have been about sharing goods and sharing information. So think about the various technologies that enable us to learn which restaurants are good to eat at, or enable us to share cars or share apartments. The COVID-19 pandemic has made sharing less attractive, right? We wanted our own space. But in a post-pandemic world, sharing is still at the heart of what a city is about, right? Cities have always been about sharing. What is an urban restaurant but a shared dining room and a shared kitchen? What is an urban park but a shared yard, a shared backyard? The beauty of these technologies is they enable us to share things more efficiently. The reason why we didn't have shared vehicles in the 1970s is that you'd go to pick up your car and there'd be like a dead body in the trunk or something, and it would be terrible because you couldn't trust the safety of it. Now you can, and it enables us to share city space more safely. That, in some sense, is the most important thing that technologies enable us to do. They enable us to work together, to collaborate, and to learn from one another.
Спасибо, Эдвард. Вы показали
Thank you so much, Edward. You showed a very interesting flowchart, which was dedicated to deurbanization, when people, amid the pandemic, tended to move to the rural areas,
по крайней мере, вот в крупных городах,
at least
прежде всего в Москве, Санкт-Петербурге,
major Russian cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, also
но в основном
showcase the same trend.
молодого населения.
But this was typical of the young people. The elderly, on the contrary, despite all the limitations and restrictions,
Оставаться в
tried to stay in the cities,
высокий уровень здравоохранения,
because actually the healthcare system in the cities is more effective.
медицинской помощи
And the
для этой категории граждан.
ambulances could reach them
Как мы,
faster. In your point of view,
во-первых, города наиболее
first of all, what would be the optimal size of the city in future?
будущее, да? Мы говорим, что у нас есть мировые города.
We say that we have global cities, which have always been the points of global growth of the last 50 years. Will the pandemic change that trend or not? Or this is a trend which is with us, and it will stay with us for some time?
Great questions. So first, I want to emphasize your point about the healthcare of cities is really a central one, that this is another example of sharing, that great urban hospitals are a shared resource, and they continue to be one of the things that actually makes cities successful. Secondly, is there an optimal size of cities? I have long believed that there is no such thing, that cities are ideally archipelagos of neighborhoods, and countries contain all sorts of hierarchies of city sizes. Ideally, people should have choices about where to live, about how big a city to locate it. I'm a friend of cities, but I recognize not everyone wants to live in a city, and not everyone wants to live in a big city. And it's a great thing that countries have big cities and small cities and rural areas to give people choices, because ultimately, freedom is the greatest currency of human life. It is certainly true that as cities grow, there are both advantages and disadvantages. People become more productive, nightlife becomes more fun as the city gets bigger, but there are also demons that come with density. Crime, contagious disease, traffic congestion, high housing costs, all of these things accompany urban size. Now, the downsides of density are mediated, are lessened by effective governance. And so this, in some sense, is the great challenge of the 21st century, is in fact making urban density livable, humane, making sure that our cities are not plagued by contagious disease and do not get overwhelmed by traffic congestion. This is a particular challenge in the developing world, where cities are most crucial, because there is no pathway out of poverty into prosperity that does not run through city streets. And yet at the same time, because of poverty, because of a limited quality of government, you often have these cities that fail to actually provide basic city services. Fixing the cities of the developing world, making our urban world more safe, is one of the great vocations, one of the great callings of the 21st century. Your last question, which was, do we think that the cities that are the bright nodes, the bright parts of our global network, do we think this will be changed by the pandemic? No, I have absolutely no fear on this whatsoever, right? That in fact, we will look forward to the 21st century as a world in which we will be more connected with each other, more desirous of being in the same places as each other. And I think I speak for everyone I know in thinking that we are just desperate to get out again and connect with each other in city streets and enjoy the joys of being once again in human contact with one another. Because in fact, this is what brings human potential. This is what brings human happiness, is actually being in a real room with someone else, not just having to connect virtually.
Эдвард, спасибо большое.
Edward, thank you so much for this your very interesting conversation. To my regret, we have to finish our session. Although we can speak hours and ask endless questions to you regarding your book, Triumph of the City, I'd like to say that in 2014,
На русском языке.
this book was translated in Russian.
Московского урбанистического.
It was initiated by the Moscow Urban Forum. Unfortunately, the circulation is limited, but as the organizers told me, everyone can send a letter to the organizers, and we can send a copy of it digitally. So I do hope very much that lots of people will get familiar with your ideas, and we will spread your ideas among the residents not only of Moscow, but of Russia in general. And thank you so much once again for joining our events. Thank you so much, and see you.
Thank you so much.